It is an honor to be here today, introducing this wonderful work on young lives. We at UNICEF have been following this study for so many years, so it is really great to see it, coming to conclusion. The team has been welcomed this week in UNICEF, and we intend to work with the results and try to envisage ways in which we can improve policies and programs for children in the future with the lessons learned from this study.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and it's a great pleasure for us to be here. This is a first opportunity in a way for all of us to come as a team to just begin to introduce some of our research. And my role is to really frame what's going to come afterwards and what the other presenters will be focusing on. And I'm going to really, more than anything else, explain something about our methodology. And then I'm going to raise two key issues that I think are emerging from our research that I would like to share with you, and hope that we can then pick up again in the discussion that follows. We argue that childhood poverty is the beginning of cycles of poverty. Even in our most poor, most marginal, most isolated rural communities, there are dynamic processes of change that are going on, and they're really very dramatic in many cases in terms of the implications for children and their experiences of childhood. So I want to make the case that childhood is not fixed either spatially or socially in the way that I think is sometimes imagined, certainly in the world of research in developed countries and in the world of policy often. There is this assumption that somehow children's needs are universal, somehow all children are the same, and we're just needing to cater for children whose needs are not being met in the way that they ought to be. And I think we should be challenging that assumption and seeing how research shows things to be very different. Yet, at the same time, one of the trends that we're observing is that in some degree, through the incursion, if you like, of new ideas, but also through policy interventions, childhood is also becoming increasingly reframed as a relatively uniform life phase. So the expectations around children and childhood are appearing to be quite similar across very, very diverse cultural contexts. And I think probably that school education is fairly fundamental to this. So, children are going through the same age grades at school all over the world practically now, and this has enormous implications for how childhood is understood and experienced. And I think the Dean also already mentioned the clash of child-rearing values that this results in. We are seeing very dramatic challenges in families being lived out by children and families in terms of this clash of different values and understandings. What is a good child? What's appropriate for child rearing and for protecting children? These values are in competing situations, but in the same family and amongst the different members of a family. And families now are struggling increasingly with these different ideas. They're receiving wisdom from the school, for instance, or from the health centre that they visit, which is telling them one thing, but traditional practice might have been very, very different. And one of the things that's come out most powerfully from our qualitative research, so in our quantitative research, we went in with our researchers' assumptions. And as you will see from the next presentations, we know, for example, that malnutrition, undernutrition is deeply damaging to children's development and their well-being and so on. But that's not necessarily what children and families are concerned about. They're actually much more likely to be worried about social risks. And I mentioned, for instance, the reputation of a girl. So there are very different sets of concerns. Parents are just as protective as policy is, but policy sometimes rides over parental concerns and parental attempts to protect their children because somehow there's the assumption that we know better. And I'm not so sure that we always do.
Growth has been extremely fast in our study countries, these 4 countries, although we were expecting 2 only of them out of them to grow extremely fast. All of them actually experienced a dramatic increase in their income. Especially growth was especially high during the period of the lifetime of the younger cohort, which was actually, they were born around 2001. But it was in all this period between 2002 and 2009 is the period where we collect our data. So all 4 countries experienced a very, I would say, dramatic increase in the income per capita. But the question is that whether this increase actually led to improvements in the circumstances for children. These improvements may mask persistent and increasing inequalities between, if you like, advantaged and disadvantaged groups.
There are 4 points of data plotted on that, and it's broken down by quintiles, by fifths of the sample. As you would see, the blue bar, the ones that are broadly constant across the spectrum, that's the children who are reported as being enrolled. The other ones are more related to child outcomes. The red bar that's increasing is an indicator of literacy. There's a close association between the relative the relative circumstance of the household and the chances of the child being reported on this test as literate. Indicators of anthropometric stunting and underweight are the worst indicators. Stunting, etc., are falling as you go up the consumption distribution. The reason I wanted to put both the enrolment and the literacy rates on the same chart is that these children are in school, and yet you still see pronounced examples of difference within the population. Let's monitor, let's understand what's happening at the base, but let's also think about broad-based solutions for policy. And I've written down the term, which is a rather British term, about progressive universalism. Let's think about broad-based systems, but targeting within broad-based systems to deliver for the poorest children.
It's a project that is not respectful of boundaries, because children's lives aren't respectful of boundaries. And there's a reason why we're finding that it's important to address the issue of the role of private schooling in children's lives. Firstly, schooling is one of the modernising and universalising features of virtually every child in the study. Not every child goes to school, but even those children who don't go to school, their lives are touched by schooling by virtue of the fact they don't go to it. Parents' aspirations are generally very high regard schooling, but of course schooling delivers unequally in terms of quality and access, and certainly in terms of outcomes. I was picking out these obvious little policy gems that we all know. The way these documents are framed to imply that states' responsibility. States parties shall make primary education available free to all. From a policy point of view, what interested me is that the World Bank's latest strategy document, by taking this rather attractive title of Learning for All, which we've often talked about over 30 or 40 years, rather than Education for All, it's clearly the desirable outcome, is partly doing that in order to then incorporate the profit and not-for-profit private sector. So the question from a policy point of view is the inclusion of the private sector as a major provider a more sustainable way forward when governments are struggling to deliver, or is it a threat to EFA goals? Why are private schools attractive for parents? Well, if you're a poor parent, and we are mainly talking here about relatively poor families, private schools offer high expectations for children. They're often English medium in India, and that's an attractive option if you're a poor parent and you want your child to compete in the competitive marketplace. English medium is desirable. It offers skills from nursery age.
In terms of the result, I only want to refer to a few things. One is the question of child poverty and equity. We know that that's an important part. Equity in the society is something important, but I want to make a few points. One, are we talking about the bottom group, the poorest of the poorest, or we are talking about the society and about the relations in the society? I think that some of the results here, some of the things that Paul was showing, speak about the dynamic of the society. So I think that is a point that we need to discuss. The issue of vertical and horizontal inequalities. You are gathering information about both things, that is to say, vertical, that is more material deprivation, and also things related with discrimination that are more horizontal, and as Charlie Steele said, these sort of durable inequalities that are related with discrimination probably are the most difficult one to modify and to change, and things related with, for example, the thing that you were mentioning about how the expectation of the parents and how the expectations move to the children, no? And what happened with that, I think that that's another point. And the other thing is you are having a longitudinal study. So the transitions, you said, the transitions are very important, but the transition in general, for example, the family has a new kid, they divorce, they split, the father disappeared, the mother, I don't know, that kind of things, you can bring information about that. And finally, the other point that we can discuss is policy implications. Complex versus simple solutions. How we manage that? Because usually when you go to the government, they don't want you to say, well, you know, this is very complicated, you have this, you have the other, you need to go. They want one silver bullet, no? So how can we manage that in a research that is so complex?